Yes, and so this study was the consequences of contention, understanding the after effects of political conflict and violence. So it was really fascinating. It focused on what are the effects of political contention, specifically from conflict and violence, primarily politically and economically in the states involved. And for context, they use contention to be any number of kinds of conflict or violence. So that could be human rights violations, civil war, protests, those kinds of things. And then what are the consequences that they have? There's a large number that they could be. This one specifically focused on politically and economically. So to do that, the authors broke down a lot of our existing research and frameworks. They explained the areas that have been studied, where there's limitations for those studies, and then where we should conduct further research. So some of the areas that they kind of focused on is, for instance, there's a lot of places that are studied, but it doesn't really go beyond that. So civil war was one that, seems to be studied repeatedly. There's a lot of information pertaining to that, what the consequences are for a nation. But there's not a lot that kind of goes like beyond that. And so they're looking at how can we get connect more of the micro and macro level perspectives, and what will that lend to us to better understand these conflicts and be able to prevent them. So we can go to the next slide. So they found, while there's plenty of research regarding post-conflict states, and the short, medium, long-term consequences, we can have a broader look at this and look at the larger connections that exist, as well as ways to help resolve some of the issues at hand. So for instance, one of the things they also talk about is a conflict trap. So economically, some countries fall into a repression, and then that can hinder their development, and then they kind of get back into this cycle of going through another conflict. And so they're saying if we can understand some of this in a broader perspective, and we can see more about what kind of contentions cause what consequences, it will just give us a better insight into everything overall. So it was a really good read. It wasn't too difficult to understand either. I think it was well worth it. I'd be interested to see if people do conduct more studies off of this as well. They had a lot of very specific suggestions for what we can do moving forward.
It was sort of like a review / future directions paper. Like, here's what we suggest, kind of. Yeah, it's such a complex issue with a lot of different lens. Were they looking at like almost building like a matrix where they could say like this type of conflict kind of typically leads to this type of outcome?
That's kind of what they're talking about. And one of the things they mentioned too is that there's a lot of this across various disciplines, but it's not really cohesive. So you have a lot of things that might make sense in their own spaces, but how can we actually connect those? And I think that's really fascinating. I think cross-disciplinary work's really critical, really important in lending those overall insights. And so I like that they touched on that very specifically, that is one way to kind of move forward, is getting a better understanding of this and putting it kind of together. So it's and in this case too, again, they focus just on politically and economically, but I think it'd be interesting to see kind of what are the larger contexts there as well. There's other consequences as a result of those contentions, and so really kind of focusing on all those pieces and putting them together, I think would be interesting.
Yeah, I think especially in reference to, Natalie, you called it like the conflict trap, right? The cyclical nature of conflict and how that pans out, especially on the larger connections, because how fitting that we're talking about this right now, considering everything that just happened in our nation yesterday, right? This is the type of research that we absolutely need to see more of. The bigger bird's eye view of history and how conflict is continuing.
You mentioned the economic aspect here, and just today I was reading a paper on conflict theory, which was about this thing called the greed hypothesis. And this is like something that's often debated, greed versus grievance, and what actually causes conflict within a country, or like intrastate or interstate conflict. And this paper argued that, and it was a paper written by the head of the development uh, area in the World Bank, like the man who really looked at like development economics, and he argued that it's mostly greed that leads to like local rebellion, especially because for like a rebellion to sustain, or for a civil war sort of a conflict to sustain, somebody has to be funding it. And otherwise, why would these people like leave their jobs, assuming they have jobs, to actually sustain a rebellion? And there's like a lot of interesting data work that this economist had done about how there's patterns of like all the countries who've had civil wars. It's always been under conditions of not necessarily ethnic conflict, but most of them had a primary resource that was being exported, like their economy was export based. That was one. And another was a very counterintuitive correlation about how if there is ethnic diversity in a country, then there most likely not be conflict, because for a rebellion to actually function efficiently, the rebel group has to be very consistent in its ethnicity, and that can only happen if like there's certain ethnic dominance, etc. So yeah, like with conflict theory, I feel like this paper is also super interesting, because the economics of conflict and all these hypotheses and causes and effects are very well placed in this literature.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the other things I found fascinating was this study touched on how there's also a strong focus on certain countries in a lot of the research that we have that's existing, and really that they should be expanding on that. And I think, Sarah, as you're mentioning, like in our nation too, I'd be curious what are the underlying causes of some of our conflict, and what are the consequences that we're experiencing. Because they noted, a lot of the countries evaluated have been third world countries, but, what about, a lot of first world countries that are also experiencing a lot of the same issues. So I think it's fascinating. And Anupriya, I think a lot of that, ties in, and I think that's sounds like a really good read.
Yeah, maybe I'll do the next review on this paper, the greed hypothesis.
Yeah, that's an interesting.
Yeah, Anupriya, when you were speaking of that, a few things came up to me that reminding me of like previous research that I've read, and the greed versus grievance. I think it ties into that. It was, a theory that I read regarding how this individual was saying that all power leads to greed eventually in some way, shape, or form. And that greed, that's what gets you in that conflict trap, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
And then just to kind of talk about Anupriya, where you're looking at like the resources, that is a huge factor in conflict, right? Like I read this book, Fred Pierce, he's a brilliant hydrologist, conflict expert, and he looks at the historical context of wars and basically all brings it down to water as the resource, and that being the factor involved in in creating war and violence. But as Natalie points out, looking at here in the United States, the resources, yes, I mean, there's definitely a lot of American citizens that don't have their needs met with basic resources, but I do think that like the political and economic conflict is about something more, and it maybe leads more to the greed, but not necessarily over resources like water or food. But
no, I would argue that there's greed still involved. For example, like there's data about how most Republicans would vote for like not having gun control, because a lot of them are investing in military weapon sort of companies that are manufacturing weapons, or like how there's a lot of profiting happening from instigating wars, or even trying to bring democracy to other countries. So a lot of the politics, although that's more international politics oriented, a lot of like the greed to win an election may also be economic, right? Because a lot of people make money off of certain lobbying and policies that a certain party will pass laws that will benefit certain companies who are paying for those politicians, sort of a thing.
Well, there's these competing and sort of supplemental interests in if you have these large groups involved in violence, because you have people like sort of maybe in the top range of the hierarchy who are motivated by greed or motivated by like certain interests, they have investments, and then there's all the other people that aren't going to make any money off things, but they're hearing what leadership is saying, and they're tapping into these basic sort of threats against their needs for safety and security and stuff. So like, hey, maybe this one group's going to benefit off of more guns being sold or something, but then so they filter this news, they filter this information down to the people, and then they say they're coming for your guns, they're taking your guns, you're not safe. And then that becomes the motivation to go out and go, we better be proactive, we better go defend ourselves. And it's all about this sort of rhetoric about safety and security. And
Jeremy, that reminds me of the one of the research we talked about a couple months ago, America's Divided Mind, which Beyond Conflict, the organization looked at, where it basically gets down to the bottom of it saying that we're not nearly as polarized as we think we are. It has a lot to do with the media and the news and what's being filtered down that people are believing as truth, but it's not. So I think that's a really interesting.
I honestly think that the media is superly they've got ulterior motives, and I think that they have become enemies of like democracy, and I think there's people at the top running these news corporations that make a lot of money when they get a lot of views. And what gets a lot of views? Threats and fear and division. You know?
100%. I could not agree more to that statement. And I'm sorry that I'm throwing out all these books and authors at you, but please, everybody read Ezra Klein's Why We're Polarized. He's a journalist, and he's in it, and he calls out the media and his industry as being the main factor in all of this mess.
For sure. For sure. It's all about who you listen to. Who you watch. Yeah. Well, I mean, and you know what's interesting here about, because you touched on this idea of you know, in this country we have most, you know, comparatively to other, you know, some other countries, we have a lot of resources. So what are we fighting over? And I think this is where social identity theory comes in, because social identity theory was a response to the idea of realistic conflict theory, which was all about people, you know, violent conflict erupts because of finite resources, and so social identity theory was like, well, yeah, but there's all kinds of conflict that erupts and people have plenty of resources. So what's that about? And that becomes, okay, well, there's reasons for people to want to be in groups and then have preference towards their in-group and prejudices towards their out-group. And then that leads to all kinds of, you know, conflicts as well. So I think
it's like there's a lot of that. Yeah, it's like there's an element of scarcity, whether you're in a resource-based conflict or maybe more social identity-based. It's just a difference, either whether it's scarcity of there's not enough room for this other group of people, or they're dangerous, or you know, the in-group out-group thing. That's interesting. Well, go for it, Sarah.
I was just thinking like this. I mean, agreed. And when we talk about the social identity, it's becoming so much, and it's taking over so much of our focus and our energy. And I can't help but see, and I hate to be a pessimist, but I can't help but see that being a big problem, right? That we're taking our interest and calling them now our identity, like as though that's part of our identity. Like we're really like stretching that term so much, and that's polarizing us.
Isn't it amazing how the human mind works? We are prone to categorize ourselves and others into social categories. And that creates a whole lot of interesting cognitive ways of thinking about us versus them.
Yeah.
Yeah.